Hey, fifth graders. This week we are going to be continuing to talk about primary and secondary sources. If you have not watched last week's video and completed the activities, I definitely suggest you go back and do those first, as they'll go into a lot more detail about the differences between the two types of sources. Today, you're going to have 20 practice questions to practice how you can identify primary versus secondary sources. Before we get started, I will let you know that this slideshow was prepared by a teacher that lives in Louisiana. So you will see a lot of questions that say things about Louisiana, but it works really well for what we're going to be studying as well. So a quick review about some of our different types of sources. So all of these can be considered primary sources. Remember, that means they were created during the time of an event. They were there when something happened. That could be things like letters, diaries, maps. It could include artifacts like clothing or toys, videos, audio recordings, newspaper clippings, photographs, newsreels, blueprints, illustrations, postcards, documents, tools, eyewitness accounts, drawings, posters. We could go on and on. So the big thing to remember with primary and secondary sources is that a primary source was created when an event took place. So if it's a Civil War soldier's uniform, then it's a primary source because it was in the Civil War and it was created during that time. Okay. Remember, with things like newspaper clippings, sometimes it is a primary source and sometimes it isn't, depending on the date. And you have to look and see if the date matches and is really close to when the event happened. If it was written much later, then it is not a primary source. It would be a secondary source. Okay. So secondary sources are usually created long after an event took place by doing research about it or learning about it in some other way. So we'll go ahead and get started. So like I mentioned, there are going to be 20 questions for you to answer. So our first question says, a girl found a box of letters written by a soldier to his wife and children during the Civil War. Are those letters primary or secondary sources? And the correct answer for this one is primary because those letters were written during the Civil War and they would give us a lot of great insight as to what was going on, what that soldier was experiencing, what was happening in the war. All right, here's question 2. My grandmother found a diary written by a daughter of a Civil War soldier dated from 1863 to 1865. She talked about what the war was like. Is that diary a primary or a secondary source? So think about a diary that someone wrote. She was a Civil War soldier. And that one is also primary as our correct answer because, again, she was living through it and writing about her experiences firsthand. All right, question number 3. I went to the library and found a newspaper written in 2005 about the first Illinois Indian tribes. Is that newspaper a primary document? So again, think about 2005 and when the first Indian tribes would have been. Would that be primary or secondary? And that one would be secondary because 2005 would be a long time after the first Illinois Indian tribes. And so we would consider that a secondary source. Here's question 4. I went to visit my grandmother. She gave me a chest. The chest was filled with her childhood items. She told me she loved her doll and her toys. When I opened it, I found her toys, some photographs, and her birth certificate. Are these things primary or secondary? So her birth certificate, the toys that she played with when she was little, those things would be primary. Okay, they were there when she was a child. Her birth certificate was there the day she was born. So those things are primary, created right in that time. Question 5. My sister and I went to the museum in town. We saw posters and buttons for the governor's race from 1980. Are those artifacts primary or secondary? So these events are in a museum preserved from the governor's race of 1980. I could see things like stickers and buttons and posters. Would those things be primary or secondary? And oh, sorry, I forgot to switch to this one. These are primary sources. Okay. So, primary source, these things that we saw in a museum because they were created in the time of that specific governor's race. All right, question number 6. Our town has a festival each year. In 1999, a newspaper reporter wrote an article on the celebration and festival. I found that 1999 newspaper at the library with the article. Is that a primary or a secondary source? Okay, so again, with the newspaper, we have to think about what it's talking about and we have to think about the date. Would it be primary or secondary? And then in this case, it is primary, okay, because it's writing about the 1999 festival and the newspaper is from 1999. So that one would be primary, created right in that same time period. Number 7. Yesterday, my brother Sam wrote a story about the Louisiana Purchase, which occurred in 1803. Is his story considered a primary document? Okay. Would it be primary or secondary? So, the Louisiana Purchase happened in 1803. This paper was just written yesterday. Would it be primary? And the answer to that is no. It would be secondary source written long after when that took place. Number 8. One Louisiana governor was Huey P. Long. He gave a Share the Wealth speech in 1934. There is a film video clip of Huey Long giving his speech in 1934. Is that news clip a primary or a secondary source? So it's his actual speech recorded on film. That would be primary. Okay, it was taken right on that day that he gave that speech. Number 9. One famous painter in the 16th century was Leonardo da Vinci. He painted a special picture called the Mona Lisa. That original painting is hanging in a museum in France. Is that a primary or a secondary source? So his original painting is hanging in a museum in France called the Louvre, and that painting is primary. It is his original painting created in the time that he created it, on when he painted it, and it has been preserved for a long time. Question 10. At our town museum, I saw many old tools, spinning wheels, and other artifacts from the year 1899. Are those items primary or secondary? So if we're looking at some tools from a certain time period, okay, they're in a town museum, those things would be primary, okay, and they've been preserved in their original condition all this time. Question 11. My grandmother wrote letters to her cousin about Mardi Gras festivals in New Orleans in 1959. She found the mask that my granny wore that year. My cousin found the box of letters and the mask and mailed the package to me. Are those primary or secondary sources? So if in the box is her mask that she wore, letters that were written in that time period, those things would all be primary. Number 12. My father told me a story about how the Superdome was built in the 1970s. The Superdome is like an athletic stadium that is in Louisiana. My dad was 19 years old when it opened in 1975. He said he remembers everything about the opening. My dad told me the story. He took pictures and brought souvenirs that day. Would the story he told, the photos, and other items be considered primary or secondary sources? So think about that one. He was there that day. He took pictures and bought souvenirs. Those things would be primary. Okay, nice job. All right, question number 13. I wanted to do a report on how Acadian people arrived here in Louisiana. I interviewed someone who knew about it. I could not interview anyone who was there because they are not living anymore. I made a video last week about Acadian life in the 1800s. Is that video a primary or a secondary source? So this video was created by someone who did research, but they could not actually speak to anyone who knew because they've all passed away. So that video would be secondary. Number 14. When I went to visit my great-grandmother last summer, I found a box of old postcards that her grandfather mailed while he was fighting in World War I. Are those postcards primary or secondary documents? So think about it. He mailed them while he was fighting, probably wrote to her about what was going on. Those would be primary. Okay? They were created right in that time period. Number 15. A month ago, I read a book about the Civil War. I enjoyed learning about the Civil War very much. I had to make a report, so I wrote my research paper on how the Civil War began in 1861. Is my report primary or secondary? And that would be secondary because I did research on the event, but that happened so long ago, I can't interview anyone who was there. I can just read about it. So my report would be secondary. All right, we are on number 16. This one says, when I went to the library last week, I saw a map that was made in 1960. It shows the streets and roads in my town at that time. It was a surveyor's map that the mayor of the town wanted to have printed at that time. Is that 1960s map a primary or secondary document? So think about when the map was created. And that one would be primary, okay, because it was created in 1960 and has been preserved in its same format in the library ever since. All right, number 17. When my mom was born, my grandmother started a diary for my mother. She wrote about what was happening at the time she was born. In the diary, she put my mom's birth certificate, baby pictures, newspaper articles, a snip of her hair, and the document with her baby handprints and footprints. What would all of those things be? Okay, so our event is the birth of her mother. Were those things all around at that time or created later? The answer is those would all be primary. They were all created right around the time that she was born and when she was growing up. All right, number 18. At a museum in Washington, D.C., a historian found a letter written by Abraham Lincoln in 1864. Is that letter a primary or secondary document? This one would be primary, because it was written during the time Abraham Lincoln was alive, okay, and he wrote it himself. Number 19. I was looking in the attic for information about my great-great-grandfather. I found his birth certificate, his high school diploma, some letters he wrote during World War II, his uniform, his wedding ring, and his marriage certificate to my great-great-grandmother. All of those would be primary. Lots of those are like official government records that are very created in a very certain time for just a very certain person. In this case, her great great grandfather. So those are primary. All right, we have one more. Number 20. A girl found a box of letters written by a soldier to his wife and children during the Civil War. Are those primary or secondary? And those would be primary. Okay, he wrote them in that certain time period, and they've been preserved ever since. All right, that is it for today. Hopefully, you found yourself doing much better, especially by the end, figuring out if something is a primary or secondary source. Thanks for tuning in today.